welcome, come one, come all, to the glory that is the real business cycle model. Or something. Anyways, from last time, if you remember, we got about this far when it came to finding the equilibrium within this particular model. Now, remember I said we were going for a general equilibrium in this case. What that means is that all markets are clearing. So, first, we have our labor markets. Firms are optimizing. They decide how much they want to produce based on the prices or the input costs they face of capital and labor. They decide how much they want to produce, and from that will determine their labor demand curve. Now, simultaneously, households are optimizing, and they're deciding how much labor they want to supply. Now, at the intersection of labor demand and labor supply, we get a market clearing wage rate, which gives us the amount of labor that firms demand, which then yields production Y star. Now, if you look, we've got Y here on the vertical axis and L on the horizontal axis. With L on the horizontal axis here and here, what we can do is we can just literally place this graph right on top of this one, and we'll be good to go. But when we're thinking about an aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, right, it's generally the convention to have output on the horizontal axis with price on the vertical axis. So we need to find a way to flip that. So all we do is over here we just come up with a graph where YT equals YT, which just gives me a 45-degree line that allows me to take what is on the vertical axis and rotate it 90 degrees so that it is now on the horizontal axis, yielding this aggregate supply curve. Now, this aggregate supply curve is independent of prices. Why? Because it's perfectly vertical. If you were to change the price, whether the price level was here or here, it would not matter. Output would be exactly the same. Now, that may mean nothing to you right now. And, well, it probably shouldn't mean too terribly much to you at all. Yet. Although, all we've done so far is just cover the supply side of the economy. Now, the demand side of the economy, I'm going to show you first what the end result is going to be, and then I might discuss a little bit about what some of the relationships are that are deriving this aggregate demand curve. But ultimately, what you will be responsible for will be just these four graphs. There will be one or two other things that you'll need to know in the event of a demand shock, namely what the source of the demand shock is. But other than that, you will only be responsible for these four graphs. Normally, I would teach it with 5 graphs. However, it's been my experience that teaching principles of macro when there's an extra graph in this ends up being just a little too much for everybody, myself included. It gets a little too complicated, and ultimately you guys end up losing more of the intuition and able to just, in order to be able to just draw better graphs, and that's not exactly what I want to have happen. So, aggregate demand looks like this. Now where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect yields an equilibrium price level P star. So when aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, we have market clearing output Y star at a price P star. And that is our aggregate demand. Now the aggregate demand curve itself is, there is a set of graphs that sort of determine what this aggregate demand curve is. Now I'm going to fly through a good chunk of it, and I'm really just going to show you what this curve, or what these two underlying curves represent. Because I could go through the derivation of it, but ultimately it just doesn't matter. So now we need to figure out exactly how this aggregate demand curve is formulated. So now that we have seen this will be the equilibrium framework that you will always deal with. So in the real business cycle model, if you ever have to analyze any sources of shocks, just recall, this will be the starting point all the time. The starting point will never change. So, that said, let's move on to exactly how the aggregate demand curve is formulated. And from there, we can hopefully get a little bit of an idea about what is going on in the background. Now, like I said, this is stuff that's going on in the background. This is not stuff that you will be held responsible for in this course. I just want you to see a little bit of what's going on. Think of it like driving a car. I'm teaching you how to drive a car, but here what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, okay, well, this is just the engine. These are the parts of the engine. You don't really need to know what all the parts of the engine are, but it helps when you're driving the car to know exactly what the hell is going on under the hood. So, let's ask ourselves, how are we going to derive aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand, which is from here on out going to be labeled AD, it's composed of two underlying equations or curves. The first one is the IS curve. Now, the IS curve is the set of all equilibrium points in interest rate and output space where goods markets clear. So instead of thinking about this in price and output space, like we are in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, what we're doing is we're looking at the role that interest rates play in determining what demand is. So this IS curve it represents, how consumption, investment, and government spending all clear in the markets in order to satisfy this resource constraint. Now, if this resource constraint looks familiar to you, well, it's because it's just GDP. So GDP is ultimately a constraint, which, as I have said before, output cannot be exceeded by the sum of consumption, investment, and government spending. Right? Now, when I talk about that crowding out effect, right, where government spending would crowd out private investment, what that means is here, right, output can't change, right, because we got that vertical aggregate supply curve. And the only thing that can change or move that vertical aggregate supply curve are supply side factors like labor supply shocks or technology shocks of some sort. Right? So as far as the demand side is concerned, it can't do very much. And when I say it can't do very much, it can't do anything at all in order to shift supply. So we look at how agents want to consume. So when I showed you the Euler equation earlier, right, that basically gets summed up in here. Now the investment part kind of becomes sort of part of the Euler equation if you think about it, because if we were to save, right, we want to consume more tomorrow relative to today, therefore it's going to be dependent on the interest rate, and that interest rate is going to determine how much people want to save. The higher the interest rate, the more they save. So these two are sort of going to be linked with each other, right? But government spending is also going to be a function of taxation, which consumption is going to be a function of taxation. If you tax households more, they can consume less. So it's a function of taxation. It's also a function of borrowing, or namely the interest rate. The more it borrows, the higher the interest rate you get. The higher the interest rate you get, the less investment you get. However, when there is a higher interest rate, households want to save more, so consumption will fall currently in order to satisfy the Euler equation in a way where current consumption drops and future consumption goes up. The more they save, the more gets invested. The more that gets invested, well, you get a little bit more output out of it. So it sort of represents how these three entities, basically households, firms, and governments, all interact with one another. And if you were to play with one, you're going to play with the other a little bit. If you affect one, you affect the other. Now, let's graph this out. So we're going to have the real interest rate on the vertical axis, and we're going to have output on the horizontal axis. So this is a set of all points where goods markets clear in interest rate and output space. Now, if you think about it, let's think about exactly what happens as the economy enters a recession. When the economy hits a recession, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, there's a lot of restructuring in the market. Because of that, interest rates tend to rise. So when interest rates go up, current consumption falls, investment falls, and holding government spending exogenous, if current consumption and current investment fall, then output is going to fall. So what we see is a nice downward sloping IS curve. Now it's called the IS curve because it is the set of all points, or all equilibrium points where goods markets clear, where investment and savings are equal to each other. So if investment and savings are equal to each other, and we're in an equilibrium case where goods markets are going to clear, it would be any point along this curve. So the higher the interest rate, the more we're going to want to save, but at the same time, the higher the interest rate, the less we're going to want to invest. So that trade-off is going to be leading to a downward sloping IS curve. Now, What is the point of this? Well, the point is any shock to consumption, investment, or government expenditures are going to be shifting the IS curve. Well, okay, that's not very helpful, so I added another sentence there. A positive shock to consumption, investment, or government spending is going to shift the IS curve outward. But when it comes to determining aggregate demand, there's more than just this particular curve that we need to be interested in, right? Because the way we can think about the IS curve while it can reflect preference shocks, which would be changes within the Euler equation over preferences for future or current consumption, which could trigger an IS shock, right? If there's some investment demand shock, it could trigger an IS shock, or an IS shift, we'll say. But what it's generally used for, because we're thinking about this in terms of policy analysis, we want to know how will certain policy be affecting the economy? In what ways will it affect the economy? Well, if we're thinking about this in terms of policy implications, well, the question really is, when we think policy, okay, really any decision made by any actor in this model is going to be a policy. So there's a policy determined by the Euler equation. There's a policy determined by exactly how much firms want to produce, etc. Yet, this IS curve is usually used to analyze fiscal policy shocks. Now, what do I mean by that? Government spending shocks. So if the government decides they want to tax more or if they want to borrow more, that would be reflected through a shift in the IS curve. So let's think about this just in terms of taxation. If the government wants to raise taxes, the IS curve will shift inward. If they want to lower taxes, it's going to shift outward. Why is that? Well, because remember, all of these guys are sort of interrelated, and consumption is a function of taxation. If you increase taxes, it's going to shift inward a little bit, because what you're going to see is less consumption. Now, they want to cut taxes, right? Well, that's going to put a little bit of a relaxation, theoretically speaking, on consumption. That's, of course, assuming that Ricardian equivalence doesn't hold, which in this model it does. If the government wants to borrow more, the IS curve will shift outward. So if the Treasury goes, well, yeah, Congress submitted this bill, and our tax revenue is not going to be good enough, it's not going to cover this. We need to borrow money. So they issue treasury bonds. Now they issue these treasury bonds over various maturities to appeal to different investors, to give them to ultimately allow their preferences for time as well as yield to be satisfied. So you'll see some of these treasuries be issued for very short term, such as 30-day treasury yields or 3-month treasury yields, something like that. Now, those treasury yields are typically considered to be money market securities. They're called money market securities because that's what the Federal Reserve purchases when they engage in expansionary fiscal policy. Now, if they were to sell some of those securities, they'd be engaging in contractionary monetary policy. But we'll have to get into that in just a second because there's another curve that we need to look at. So the IS curve is used to reflect fiscal policy changes ultimately. So if the government borrows more money, the IS curve is going to shift out, which means because this is all linear stuff, all these relationships are linear, what that means is if they borrow more, it shifts out. If they borrow less, it shifts in. But that's not all. That's not all, folks. Or, in the words of the late, great Billy Mays, but wait, there's more. So, well, what's the more? Huh? Glad I asked, because, well, you can't, because I'm talking to a camera that has absolutely no feedback. The camera can't tell me to screw myself. The camera can't go, boo, if I make a really horrible dad joke. The camera just sits there, quietly. This is really depressing. Thank God it's sunny outside today. So, that explains some of the behavior of the IS curve, at least to the extent that I think you should be responsible for. So we've got the IS curve. Explain that already. What's the other underlying equation? Well, the other underlying equation is the LM curve. That burp was sponsored by the Pepsi Cola Corporation. Thank you, Mountain Dew. The LM curve is the set of all output and interest rate points. So again, it's in this graph, output and interest rate space, where money markets are going to be in equilibrium. So I discussed money markets with short-term treasury bills. Those treasury bills get issued. They are issued by the Treasury. They are not issued by the Federal Reserve, well, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And most developed countries have relationships with their central bank that is very similar to what we have. The way it works is once Congress submits a bill and the Treasury looks at it and goes, well, our tax revenue is not that great. Congress wants to spend an extra billion or so dollars. It'd be nice if it was only $1 billion. They usually want to spend a couple $100 billion extra. So they want to spend all this extra money that we're not getting through tax revenue. So what do? What's our only option? Well, they can borrow money. So they go out into the open market, the Treasury does, and they sell these Treasury yields at various maturities for reasons that I discussed earlier. Now, once those Treasuries are on the open market, those assets have value. Right? Because if you give the government your money, they give you a piece of paper. And that piece of paper says basically just a really expensive IOU. Now, it will be paid over various periods where you'll get a little bit of the principal, a little bit of the interest rate back. right? But now the Federal Reserve will go out after these treasuries have been issued by the Treasury Department. They'll go out and then purchase some of these treasuries, but they do so after the Treasury has already issued these bonds, and they do so independently of the Treasury. What that means is that the Federal Reserve is ultimately independent of the federal government. Okay, that you've probably heard that before. What exactly does that mean in more real-world terms? Well, what that means is the Federal Reserve doesn't just print money for the sake of printing money. They print money consistent with a particular mandate that we'll be discussing a little bit later, and as they do so, what they're doing is they are buying these assets that already have value, right? These treasury bonds, or these treasury bills, depending on the maturity, have value because that piece of paper still has value on it. So what they'll do is they will purchase that treasury bill or bond, and they will convert that treasury into money or liquidity. So as they go out and they purchase these treasuries after the Treasury has already issued them, they go out and purchase them and provide liquidity to the markets, meaning cash. Therefore, if there is a huge spike in demand for money, and a lot of financial institutions can't meet their short-term financial obligations, well, sadly, if there's this huge demand for money, and they can't meet their financial obligations, that doesn't mean that they're insolvent. It means they're illiquid. If you have assets of positive value, but you don't have enough cash in order to meet your obligations, you are what's referred to as illiquid. When you are illiquid, right, it's like going, okay, I've got this house that's worth $500,000, but, you know, I owe my pot dealer, oh, my God, no pot dealers here. I owe my friend who provided me with a particular good a little bit of money, which is way less than, you know, the value of my house, but I can't just give them a fraction of my house that they're going to be like, dude, why? I already live somewhere. So in order to be able to actually meet your financial obligation, right, you could sell your house. But you probably sell your house at a discount, which sucks. So, like I said, if it was a $500,000 house, you need to sell it ASAP because, you know, your friend's probably going to cap your knees or, you know, cut off a limb or something like that. Well, what you need to do is sell your house, but it's going to be sold at a discount because you got to sell it fast, right? Because you want that leg still attached, right? Or you want one of your fingers still attached. Actually, I want all 10 of my fingers still attached. Thank you very much. Not just one of them. So in that case, if you had to sell the house immediately, you're not going to get $500,000 for it. You'll probably get like $100,000. You got to find someone who's willing to buy it, and you got to do it fast, which means basically you are just dumping everything into the market. You're flooding the market, driving the price of it down, and the economy is going to lose a lot of value. But if you got a couple of these treasury bonds, and the Federal Reserve goes, oh, hey, I see you owe somebody money. Here's what I will do. I will purchase enough of these treasury bonds for you to meet this short-term financial obligation, so that way your company, or just you, really, don't lose a leg, one of your fingers, anything of that sort. You don't get your knees broken. I'm just going to convert some of this other stuff you own into cash and let you meet your obligations. So ultimately, there has been no real change of anything. They weren't adding money into the economy. All they were doing is just buying up something that already had value, and they convert its value into cold hard cash. So, enough of a rant about monetary policy and how it works in the United States. So we've got this set of all points where money markets are in equilibrium. Now, it's called the LM curve. Because it represents the liquidity preference of money. and it's upward sloping in output and interest rate space. So, you have this. Now where it clears, we get an equilibrium real interest rate, RT star, and we have an equilibrium output, YT star. So, where the IS curve was used to represent fiscal policy, the LM curve is typically used to represent monetary policy shocks. So, what happens under a monetary policy shock? Well, the money supply increases shifting the LM curve out. So it would shift to the right. And increases output. Although it's not increasing output from the demand side or from the supply side, it's doing really the demand for output. So let's say instead of output, we'll say output demand. All right, so the LM curve, as we configure, is a function of money. It's a function of the money supply, or the amount of money that is circulating throughout the economy. Now, if the money supply increases, the price level will increase. Right, so if I increase the amount of money circulating throughout the economy, remember I gave this example in class a couple of times, where I said we had our own little miniature economy, and I did a helicopter drop of money, and I asked what would happen to production. Well, increasing the money supply does nothing to increase production. However, it does increase the price level, at least in this model. So if the price level goes up, it's going to shift the LM curve back in. Now, in the event prices are flexible, like they are in this model, it's going to shift in by the exact same amount that it shifted out when the money supply increased. So it's a function of money and prices. Now, what I didn't explain is that either a shift to the IS or LM curve will shift demand. So the intersection of the IS and LM curves will determine what aggregate demand is. So remember, we've got output on the horizontal axis here, which means I can draw a graph underneath it where output is on the horizontal axis. And here, instead of an interest rate, I'm going to have the price level. I'm going to erase this YT star. And rewrite it down here. Now I drew this dotted line from the intersection of the IS and LM curves down to the aggregate supply curve and drew a vertical line downward. That is not to say that it's determining aggregate supply. It's still determining aggregate demand, right? But this intersection is also going to be determining the intersection between demand and supply, right? So really what I should have done was just drawn a dotted line down to this aggregate demand curve. So let's see what happens if we were to increase the money supply in this model. All right, so this is our beginning equilibrium, Y star and P star, with a real interest rate R star. When the LM curve shifts out, money supply increases, right? All right, so money supply goes up. The real interest rate drops. And the horizontal distance that the LM curve shifted along the IS curve. So what we're doing is we're allowing the money supply to change, but we're holding any fiscal policy measures constant, right? Because we only want to look at one shock at a time. Looking at multiple shocks leads to an identification problem. We don't want that. Right? This identification problem would be, well, okay, if there's a money supply shock and a fiscal policy shock, what's going on? Well, it's going to be fairly difficult to determine that. However, if we do each one individually, and then we can look at what the individual responses are, we can get a little bit better of an idea. But we want to do it individually. Remember, we're scientists here. And as scientists, we want to change one thing at a time. We don't want to change two things. So we're allowing everything to remain constant except for the money supply currently. So this horizontal distance the LM curve shifted is going to be equal to the horizontal distance that aggregate demand gets shifted outward. Like this. Right, now this is the output that we want to have. Right, well, it's a higher level of output. Why wouldn't we want more output? Everybody wants more output. More output means more income. More income means everybody's better off, right? We're happy. But if everything's already as totally efficient as it can possibly be, that level of output is inefficient. We're not in equilibrium here. This is a point where aggregate demand does not equal aggregate supply. Now, if output here can't change because it's vertical, what has to happen? Well, remember I said the LM curve is a function of money and prices. And if prices are fully flexible, what happens is the money supply increases, but the price level is going to increase. And as the price level increases, the LM curve shifts in. So as prices go up, prices will increase, and it's going to shift this curve back inward. And it's going to shift it right back to where it started. With a new price level. And what that means is if it shifts in like that, Now remember, it shifts out because of an increase in the money supply. If we look at these graphs, that is not M, that is not M, this is Y, this is P. Neither of these are the money supply. So an exogenous shift to the money supply will shift the LM curve and it will shift aggregate demand. But as prices go up, prices are accounted for in this model, right? They're right here. So if prices go up, aggregate demand is not going to shift back inward. All that's going to happen is we're going to go to a new point on this new aggregate demand curve, which is right here. So, if the monetary authority decides to use expansionary monetary policy to try to improve the equilibrium in this model, they are unable to do so because prices just immediately adjust. Excuse me. Prices immediately adjust, and we end up at the same level of output we had before, just at a higher price level. So to summarize, LM curve shifts out when the money supply increases. So aggregate demand shifts out when the LM curve shifts out, and it shifts out by the same horizontal distance. But prices are fully flexible. So prices are fully flexible. The LM curve is going to shift back in this output interest rate space graph, which is this ISLM setup we've got right here. Now it's shifting back in because that is not price and that is not price. So if a variable that's causing the shift, or that's, if a better way to put it, if a variable is moving and it is not labeled on either of these axes, then you're going to see a shift. Now, if the variable is moving and it is labeled on this axis, you won't see a shift, you'll just move to a new point on the existing curve. So the LM curve shifts back in because there's no price, there's no price. It shifts back in. But in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply space, as the price level increases, price is defined in this graph right here. So as the price level increases, we move along this new aggregate demand curve. So where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. Prices were fully flexible. Meaning output doesn't change, only the price changes. I don't know why I'm standing here waiting for you to soak this up, because honestly, you can just push pause. Right, so that's what happens under a monetary policy shock. So under this model, what we've seen is that a monetary policy shock does nothing. And as we move back up over here and the LM curve shifts back in, what happens is we return to exactly the same interest rate that we were at before. So it returns back to its initial interest rate, RT star. So why does it do that? Well, if you remember, there's that Fisher equation thing that I showed you that related real and nominal interest rates So you're probably thinking the real rate fell, at least at first, but I thought this had monetary neutrality. If it had monetary neutrality, why is the real rate falling at all? Right, it's probably a question that's going through your mind. Well, the thing is, it tries to change, but it doesn't actually change. So answer. It doesn't change at all. Why does it not change at all? Because prices are fully flexible. And what that means is that if prices are flexible, they immediately adjust to a demand shock. So what's actually going on is that the real interest rate is trying to fall, but because prices immediately pick up for that, it just goes right back up. So remember that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve, or the central bank in general, can only control the nominal interest rate. They can hope to control inflation, thereby adjusting the real rate. They can only directly manipulate the nominal rate. So a monetary policy shock reduces the nominal rate. So they reduce the nominal interest rate they reduce the nominal interest rate and prices are flexible, the drop in the nominal interest rate is going to be equal to the increase in inflation. So let's say they try to cut interest rates, or nominal interest rates, by 5%. So if the inflation rate, or the nominal interest rate cuts by 5%, inflation spikes by 5%, the real interest rate remains unchanged. So if we just use this equation here, the real interest rate is 5%, the nominal rate 7%. That implies the rate of inflation has to be 2%. So just plugging into this, I get 0.05 equals 0.07 minus 0.02. So let's say the Fed wants to cut the nominal interest rate to 0.03. Right? They do this by increasing the money supply, therefore the cost of borrowing money falls because there's more money to be lent out. But at the exact same time, the whole economy was already prepared for it. So the rate of inflation is going to increase by 0.04. Why? Well, the nominal rate was cut by 0.04 down to 0.03. Right, so if we want this real interest rate to remain unchanged, 0.05 equals, instead of 0.07, which is where it was, it's now at 0.03. All right, so if that happens, all right, what do we need to have? Well, we need to have minus, because remember we're subtracting out the rate of inflation. So let's see, if we drop this by actually I'll let this one be. We would get is this. So 0.05, 0.07 minus 0.04, right, what is that? 0.03. Now, let's just go ahead and distribute this negative throughout this change in inflation here. Minus 0.02 plus 0.04. So we get 0.05 equals 0.03 minus 0.02. Well, 0.03 minus 0.02 is just 0.01 plus 0.04 equals 0.05. So the change in inflation is going to offset the change in the nominal interest rate to leave the real interest rate completely unchanged. So if the real interest rate is completely unchanged, prices increased enough to make sure this thing remained unchanged. Therefore, all that happened was as soon as there's an aggregate demand shock, everybody's prepared for it, blammo, we end up at the same level of output, but at a higher price level. So I said the economy was already prepared for it. They immediately adjust to it. This is what's called rational expectations. Which means every market participant has full and complete information on everybody else. So if the Federal Reserve, or really just the monetary authority, wants to cut interest rates by increasing the money supply, well, the economy already knows they're going to do that. Right? They have, basically what this says is they've got access to the central bank's framework, the central bank's objective function. So they know what the central bank's objective function is. So if they know what it is, they know that the Fed is going to want to increase the money supply to lower interest rates to try to spark a demand shock in hopes of triggering an increase in output. But they're already prepared for it. Why? Because they know what the Fed wants to do. So if they know what the Fed wants to do, anything the Fed does, they're prepared for it already, and they render whatever policy shocks the Fed initiates completely moot and pointless. So, under rational expectations, basically all that changes in this case would be a nominal variable, which is the price level, and the nominal interest rate. So the nominal rate will drop, but the price level increases by the amount the nominal rate drops in order to stabilize the real interest rate, thereby ensuring there is no change to any real variables.